Hi, good morning, everybody, and sorry for the slightly late start. We had a little technical difficulty with the webinar software. It's great to see so many supporters and friends of Gold Standard on the line today. If you don't know me, I'm Owen Hewlett. I'm the Chief Technical Officer here at Gold Standard. And today's topic is future-proofing the voluntary carbon markets with a particular slant on double counting under the nationally determined contributions post 2020. The format today is that I'm going to give a short presentation, which is similar to the workshop we held recently at the Gold Standard Conference, and really is an opportunity for those that couldn't join us in Berlin to hear about that, to hear what we discussed, and to start sharing some of your views. My presentation should last around 15 to 20 minutes at max, and then we've got an opportunity to share any questions. Just in terms of housekeeping, if you have questions, you'll see hopefully on your GoToWebinar control panel, there is a question function. To keep things moving forward in a hopefully fairly smooth way, I'd ask you just to drop your question in there. If you type it in there and hit return, I'll be able to see it and I'll work through them. Feel free to do that while I'm presenting, and then there'll be a list for me waiting when I finish that presentation. And then lastly, we will share the recording and the slides of this webinar after the fact. And you can see that at our YouTube channel, and it'll also shortly be uploaded to the new network engagement platform that Gold Standard is running. But as a registrant even of the webinar, you should receive a pack shortly. So if you don't receive anything within a week or so, do feel free to chase me up. So I'm going to share my screen and walk through this short presentation. As I say, this is a presentation that we shared with colleagues at the Gold Standard Conference in Berlin a week or so ago. And it really caps the end of a first phase of work that we've been conducting on double counting and goes some way towards our working with colleagues within the market. So the first thing I would say is that, and I'll explain more about what the double counting issues are in case that you've not kept pace with that discussion. But the first thing I would say is that the issue of double counting is not unique to Gold Standard. It's not something we're pursuing unilaterally. It affects all of us in the voluntary market, and we're very keen to work with our stakeholders and supporters, but also with colleagues at other standards like VCS, ACR, and also with other market participants such as ECROA. I'll actually be at Innovate for Climate next week, so anybody there that wants to follow up and have a discussion, I'd be very open to that. I'm also joining the ECROA events, and Gold Standard has an event on the Thursday evening there. So if you're at I4C and you want to say hi and maybe share some further ideas, feel free to let me know. So I'll dive right in. So we have just recently published a paper for consultation and a tool, which I'll come on to in a moment. It's called Future Proofing the Voluntary Carbon Markets, Double Counting Post 2020. And I'll just quickly hop on to my browser to show you where you can find that. If you go to Our Work, Consultations and Grievances, and then scroll on down, you can see all of our open and closed consultations. The Future Proofing the Voluntary Carbon Market has formally closed, actually, but I'm still open to feedback, so feel free to share any ideas. And within that, you can download here the report and the draft tool. So please do take a look at that. I'd very much welcome any future views, even though the formal consultation is closed. That's not the last chance to share ideas. Just to give you a rundown of what we've been doing in this program. So phase one, which is kind of closing with these webinars actually, was to produce a tool to assess the risk of double counting and to test those findings with a view to leading on to what solutions might be available. And so the tool you'll see does not propose any solutions at the moment. It's really only a tool to assess whether a project is definitely captured within the NDC reporting, definitely not captured in the NDC reporting, or in the majority of cases, potentially not, but with some grey areas to be discussed. And that really informs the solutions discussion, which we want to have in phase two. And that phase two began in Berlin a couple of weeks ago with our conference. It goes on through these webinars. It includes our attendance and discussions at I4C and very much our work with other standards and other stakeholders to find solutions. So just a brief note on double counting. What we're actually talking about is that the emission reduction or removal is double counted where it is used more than once to achieve climate change mitigation efforts. And so in simple terms, if we issue a VER and that VER is bought and claimed by a voluntary buyer, and is also effectively captured within the NDC reporting towards the country's targets, then the effect of that emission reduction is being counted twice. And that's an issue for environmental integrity and confidence in our marketplace. One thing that's worth noting here is post-2020, why that is a different issue to what it's been before. And that is because unlike the Kyoto era, where a subset of countries had a Kyoto target for reducing their emissions, the NDCs imply, this is a sweeping statement, but the NDCs imply that every country now has some kind of reporting target. And hence there's no opportunity to issue VERs in countries that aren't following a target and therefore won't be counting them. So really the difference is that there's no kind of automatic safe place to issue VERs and avoid double counting post 2020, and that's really why it's an issue for all of us. I want to give a huge credit to Lambert Schneider, who some of you will know from his work with the CDM Executive Board or his work as an associate fellow over at the Stockholm Environment Institute. There's some slides in this pack that are from Lambert. Lambert worked closely with us to develop the report and the tool. And you'll be able to tell his slides, they're generally in this alternative blue format. But yeah, very much credit to Lambert for all his help. And hopefully I can do it some justice. But really just to flag here that, gone too far, really just to flag here that the issue we're really facing is the double claiming issue there in the middle, that reductions are claimed by a country and the credit user. And Lambert goes on to talk about some of the solutions that I'll mention in a moment. Just briefly before I go on to that detail, just want to flag the tool itself. I'll hop over to Excel. The tool is where I showed you on the website. Like I say, it's in draft. It's not meant to be something that's mandatory right now. So if you're a gold standard project coming forward, this is not something that you have to do as a requirement of the standard to be certified. It's really a first attempt at a tool that helps us explore where and how a project and a VER might be double counted, or what further information would be needed. I don't intend to walk through the tool right now. It's got a guideline and it's self-explanatory, but just to really sort of show what it looks like, it's a series of questions that zone in on whether a project is going to be or potentially captured under an NDC. That's really the purpose of the tool. What it doesn't do is propose a solution to that. So for example, it might well show that a project doesn't appear to be captured under the NDC, but there's some grey language around that in the NDC. And that's pretty common actually in our testing, and I'll come on to that. What it doesn't do is say what needs to be done about that. So it doesn't sort of set a calibration for what we would accept as suitably clear or unsuitably unclear. That's really for the next round of discussions. So hopping back to my PowerPoint. So what we found with the initial testing we did, and some thanks to some colleagues that did some really useful testing for us. The testing is certainly not exhaustive, but I think it's indicative, and I'll come on shortly to how further testing will take place and how the tool will be refined further in this presentation. But some findings from the testing and from discussions with stakeholders is a near consensus that the type of double counting that I've discussed is a real issue and a threat to market integrity. There is a kind of minority view that these are two forms of accounting, national inventory versus emission reduction at project level, and that really there's no issue. There's also a suggestion that maybe the amount of credits we issue is immaterial to national inventory accounting. And while we might have some sympathy with those views, I think we also need to keep in mind that Corsia will come forward for the airline industry with an enormous demand for carbon credits, and Corsia is 100% going to consider double counting an issue. And so it'd be very strange for us to argue in one part of the voluntary market that double counting is no problem, when by far the biggest demand signal is saying otherwise. I think also it's worth noting that whatever your stance here, if there is a group of buyers that's in the majority that considers this or perceives this to be a risk, then even if you found a way to argue that it technically wasn't a risk, then that perception is certainly going to undermine our efforts. And so, either through technical consensus or perception consensus, or in most cases both, everybody, I think, is agreed that double counting is a threat to our market integrity and viability, and that's not something we can tolerate, and so solutions are essential. It represents an issue for nearly all project types. So I said we haven't done exhaustive testing. We've done a pretty broad sample, and you can see some of the very high-level findings in our reports. There aren't many project types in countries that we can say for sure don't have any uncertainty. Now I don't want anybody to think for a second here that I'm saying all projects are double counted, and that's something I want to correct, because that's how it came across at our conference, and that's not what I mean. But there are questions, and so you might find that a particular sector isn't mentioned in an NDC, and so you think your project type, has no chance of being double counted. But then, there might be some vague or contradictory wording elsewhere in the NDC that makes it tricky to be 100% sure. So there's not many project types that are definitely 100% excluded. Not many of the NDCs include exclusion lists. There are a bunch of project types that are definitely included, where they're explicitly named. And then, the majority, I think, fall in this grey bucket, which is, some vague language, some difficulty establishing whether it's captured or not. And really, that's the next bullet here: is the NDCs are not user friendly. They're not clear. And in many cases, it's not that easy to tell for sure. But what the tool can do is highlight where that uncertainty is. And I'll come on to how it relates to the solutions in a minute. And then the last, again, I would emphasize this, is that the market expects the key players, by which I mean the standards, the voluntary standards, and perhaps people like Corsia, to work together. So nobody wants to see unilateral action. Nobody wants to see different solutions popping up across the market, because that hurts all of us. And I would stress that Gold Standard appreciates, understands, and is on board with that. And we very much are engaging with the Corsia process and with Acroa and our colleagues at VCS and the other standards. So I just want to, before I go into some of those solutions, just to remind ourselves really what are the key attributes of a voluntary carbon credit. So we know that historically it holds the rights to claim the emission reduction. We know that they are additional and that they can be owned, traded, and retired in our registry functionality, and that's pretty standard across the different regulators. We know that they go beyond country commitments. So, as I said earlier, they typically can't be. They typically could only be issued in non-Kyoto target countries, and we know that they aren't double counted. So all of those standards that I've mentioned have double counting guidelines and a way of working around that. And this is where things get a little bit vague, and this is an interesting side discussion, I suppose, is that the claim, so carbon neutrality, climate finance, et cetera, there's some common language that's certainly developed in the market over the last 15 years. But what's become clear, I think, in our discussions and our presentations at COP, et cetera, last year, is that some of that language, even if people are using the same term, carbon, climate neutrality, they don't necessarily always mean the same thing or use the carbon credits in the same way. But equally, what became clear at our conference is that we shouldn't just throw that away. So it's been a lot of effort by our colleagues at the retail community and the project developer community to educate their buyers towards certain language and to find a way to leverage finance towards carbon credits. And certainly we don't want to throw that away at the same time. So this may be an opportunity to clarify some of that language, and I'll come on to that shortly. And so on to solutions. So really, just to first say that for the reasons I mentioned earlier, the technical and perception reasons and how they affect our market, do nothing is really no solution here. There's no do nothing option that Gold Standard feels it can pursue. And without speaking for the other standards, that's a pretty commonly held view. I'm happy to kind of hear people's arguments for that, but certainly from our perspective, after phase one, we really want to be focusing on what to do about it, not whether it's an issue. And then there's really two buckets of solutions here in the blue and the yellow. So the two blue relate to how carbon credits work with the NDC accounting, and the two yellow really are potential to develop an alternative solution. So the first and second there, the accounting adjustment and non-NDC crediting are two sides of the same coin. And that's very much in line, I think, with where Corsia will go. And the other two there, alternative VER claims and ER statements, are kind of an idea that could potentially sidestep the problem by changing the nature of the claim that's made around carbon credits, such that it kind of lives within the NDC accounting and therefore, by nature isn't double counted. And I'll try and explain those in a little bit more detail. Before I do that, I would also note that if people see other solutions, we are not close to those. These are the solutions that we saw. They align pretty well, actually, with the work and the white paper that CROA presented earlier this year. And so we feel like we're along the right tracks. But certainly, if people have other ideas or other solutions, then we'd very much be interested in discussing. So just briefly to give a summary of the solutions that we are talking about. So in the first two here, accounting adjustments and non-NDC crediting, really here we're talking about establishing whether the VER and the project are potentially reported under the NDC. If they are, then the NDC account itself would need to be adjusted to allow the release of a carbon credit. So evidence that an NDC accounting adjustment is provided. Now, I haven't attempted to say what that evidence should be or who it should be from or who would scrutinize it, but that's really work to follow. And in the non-NDC crediting option, you prove that the VER is not reported under the NDC, and therefore it can be issued as it always has been because it can't possibly be reported. Again, I haven't gone as far as to say what evidence would be required for that, whether we'd still need some sort of letter of permission, etc. That's really a discussion to be held in phase 2. But what our tool can do is to show whether something is definitely captured under the NDC and therefore an accounting adjustment is required, or whether there's a potential for non-NDC crediting. And in many cases, I think the tool will help us show what the right question to ask is. So where there's those grey areas or things are counted or maybe counted that you didn't expect, then the tool will at least give you the option to phrase the question that you need to go and ask your host regulator. And I think it can be quite useful in that respect. But really, those first two solutions work within the accounting framework of the NDCs. And then the second bunch of solutions, the alternative VER definition / new instrument ER statement, are really about shifting from a model of ownership and going beyond the NDC to one of attribution, i.e. you caused it to happen, and that impact is seen as a contribution to the NDC. And so kind of being positive, it kind of acknowledges and celebrates the fact that the NDC reporting is better off for your project. You've contributed to it. And that's a subtle shift, and it is a bit of a sidestep, I suppose, of double counting. But I think those of you that work with corporates in the developed world, for example, we get asked this question all the time: is that actually many of those would be keen to contribute to their host NDC, and so I think there is a potential demand for that if we can find the right way to package and phrase it. And what I'm saying here is, we could either do that using the VER instrument, or we could do that with a new instrument like a statement of emissions reductions instead. And again, we haven't really proposed which of those is preferable yet. So I want to quickly hop back to an impression of Lambert Schneider, which I'm by far not clever enough to give, but I'll give it my best shot, really, to talk about those accounting approaches, those first two solutions. And this is a useful slide that Lambert shared at our conference, which sets out a simple or relatively simple process for doing that, which involves the identification of the countries where the carbon credits will be issued. Some project types, for example, if you're a renewable energy project, in one country, you might have an impact in another, and vice versa. I think you see that in the grids around Southeast Asia and South Africa, for example. So where are the carbon credits being issued from? And then for each of those, identify the relevant NDC targets and whether the project and VER is potentially captured. And I think that's where our tool comes in. And that then, for each one, is an adjustment necessary / is the credit outside the NDC? And then step 4 here is kind of speculative, I suppose, but obtain some kind of evidence that the countries have applied an adjustment or given confirmation that no, it won't be counted in your NDC. And then obviously the credit would be used as it currently is. And so for those credits that we find not to be in the scope of NDCs, Lambert proposes that we don't necessarily require an adjustment, as there's no double counting, is option one. Option two is that we require an adjustment regardless. I think that's unlikely, given that why would an NDC adjust its account if it can be shown that a VER isn't going to be counted there anyway? You're really asking somebody to do worse against their accounting for no good reason. But Lambert gave us an interesting statistic, and I'll see if I can find the background research to this. But around 12 to 14% of GHG emissions in 2030 are outside scope. So that kind of backs up what I was saying earlier, that a lot of projects will be affected by double counting, but there are some that are potentially outside. So the estimate for that is around 12 to 14%, probably slightly higher given the nature of the projects that we credit. But what Lambert, I think, is saying here is that there is the option here to discuss what to do in the case where the NDC doesn't need adjustment. And some of the pros and cons for that. So if you do require adjustments, or I won't go through this slide in detail, but if you don't require adjustments in the non-NDC crediting, then certainly it avoids double claiming, and that's really what we're aiming to see here. So I'll just pause briefly to allow people to read over this slide, which we'll share. And so just to hop on to some of the claims around those solutions. So the accounting adjustment non-NDC crediting model, the narrative claim would remain as offsetting, and the summary claim of that would be continuation of the carbon or climate neutral discussion that's been going on for the last 15 years. And the asset we'd be issuing, as always, has been a VER or a CER, a carbon credit. So really the accounting adjustment and non-NDC crediting options really keep the functionality and the asset class that we've always had, but requires new requirements to be able to issue those. I suppose there is some risk around the carbon neutrality claims here, and there's some risk around the ability to issue those. And that's probably the biggest influence on this solution, is how viable will it be to get that evidence from the host regulator. And what will that evidence be is up for discussion. But if you could imagine that we'd need some kind of proof that the host regulator approves the NDC adjustment, then how is the best way to do that? Will we expect a letter? Who should that letter be from? What should it say? What should be the timing? So we want to make sure, I think, in this solution that we don't throw an impracticality in the way of projects. Because my kind of ethical fear here is that the biggest projects and best supported project developers may well have the ability to do that. Some of the smaller ones and some of the more vulnerable community projects, for example, are unlikely to be able to do that, and unlikely to get a response by the nature of the governments of the countries that they work within. And so what I don't want to see is this solution favour the much larger projects over those that serve, say, vulnerable community projects or something. That would be a real shame. So there is a risk within this solution, if not designed well, that the need for evidence of adjustment or non-NDC crediting could become a barrier. Having said that, the CORSIA process that we've been tracking, it certainly suggests that this is the way that will go. And I think with the clout of CORSIA, that the sheer scale of demand, you would expect that that will also drive some greater competence in adjustments of accounting. So that's an interesting thing to watch out for. Just a plug, really, just to say that Gold Standard's working with alongside this double counting, which is more a technical issue. We are also working with some really excellent partners around the market side. So how can Gold Standard work with folks like the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, CDP, science-based targets, for example, for carbon credits, and RE100 for our REX labels? We're working with those bodies to best position the use of offsets and renewable energy certificates, such that they can fit within the corporate buyers market. So this triangle kind of represents the different options people have. So, for example, we expect corporates really should be measuring and disclosing via GHG protocol or CDP, and setting those targets via science-based targets. And then, at the top end there, how can we go beyond those kind of inventory level reporting and finance beyond? And sorry, just to say, there's various papers on our website around corporate climate leadership that I would urge you to go and take a look at. So these really focus more on the market demand than the technicality of double counting. but still might be of interest for you to see where that thinking is going. And then just to think a little bit about the new claims, so the new VER claims or the new instruments, so thinking about what those could look like in that second bucket of solutions. So the narrative claim really shifts to one of having financed or funded an emission reduction and to have helped a country reach or exceed its NDC. And the summary claim really is around the accountability and the attribution of those emissions and emission reductions, and have funded a kind of lower NDC, I suppose. There is a question mark next to net zero emissions, whether we could somehow think about that as a narrative claim that could be beneficial. And we're also working on our own kind of climate plus. There you can see the GS kind of conceptual branding around a climate plus mark that works with our corporate climate leadership guidelines, which you can see on the website. And really the asset name would remain as a kind of emission reduction, which you could either unitize or aggregate into a statement. So in summary, really, these new claims wouldn't necessarily need to look all that different to what we've done historically. It's really a more subtle change around the claim to avoid the issue of double counting. We may, from our perspective, we don't yet know which would be the right or have the most demand as a solution. It may be that both need to exist, both those NDC accounting adjustments and this option may need to exist side by side. And what we need to be careful of in that model is that there's not necessarily seen as one as higher value than the other, but really just to share what we see as a very kind of conceptual level, alternative claim solution. And this really, I think, chimes pretty well with what ICROA had presented in their white paper earlier in the year. So some questions to think about. We held in Berlin a really useful workshop where we broke out into working tables to think about these questions. And I don't necessarily want answers to these now, but as you look back over these slides and you think about how the market develops over the next 12 months, what are the benefits of the solutions we presented today? And critically, I think, what would be needed for the market to accept it? And what are the key risks and barriers? So how can we float these solutions and hopefully make them attractive to the market? What claims should a buyer or funder be able to make under each solution? And can we reach a market consensus on that language? So it's an interesting quirk of the carbon markets when I compare it to, say, some of the other sustainable development standards like FSC or Fairtrade, who are partners of ours, that they're much more clear, I think, on their claims, and we, inspired by them last year, produced some clearer claims guidelines. But the claims around carbon credits have really been kind of regulated informally by the market, which is quite unusual, I suppose. And we're not saying that we want to necessarily set up a kind of rigid framework and go and police what people are saying, but might this be an opportunity while we're thinking about double counting and claims to think about what those claims should be and whether we can reach a clearer consensus on some of the terminology and what it means. And finally, as I said earlier, do you see any other solutions? Totally open if people have alternative solutions. I would say at this point, it would take a very, very convincing argument to us and to many other stakeholders that this just isn't an issue. I don't think any of us really believe that, but I'm certainly willing to discuss that with people over a coffee or a beer at a conference if I see you. But are there any other solutions that anybody sees that you'd like us to see? You'd like to see Gold Standard pursue? And just to wrap up, like I say, Gold Standard is participating in the ICROA process and also as part of a working group towards ICAO's CORSIA working groups to reach consensus on what the solution should be. And I think that work has helped clarify in our minds, certainly. And just before I wrap up by talking about the next steps, like I say, the tool right now is not part of our standard as a formal requirement, and is more an optional thing that we would encourage people to participate in. Oops, excuse me. And so what we're doing next is to go into phase 2, really, which is where we want to set up some working groups with interested participants using our new network engagement platform. And it's really an open call to you guys and to your colleagues when you return to your organizations after the webinar to come and join us. We're looking for people that are voluntary carbon market players. I think particularly retailers and project developers. We are also engaging, as I say, with governments and with the CORSIA process, and so we can help connect that. But very interested in the views of project developers and retailers. It's totally free to join. It kicks off this month, which is what this webinar is all about, really, as a kickoff. And so if you would be willing to sign up to that phase 2 working group, what we're really looking for is some testing of the grid, and then some discussions around developing consensus-based solutions based on what I've presented today. And there'll be a series of working group webinars through the rest of this year. So please do, if you feel you can add something to that, or you're interested in monitoring progress, then please do reach out to myself or colleagues to join that. Like I say, we'll be sending a reminder on that shortly. Like I say, the working group sessions will really be around the tool, the challenges on the tool and evidence needed, the solutions. So how do we develop those post-2020 pathways, and then sharing and positioning of communications. So as I say, we kicked off in April, and with these webinars, if you do want to join that working group, I would urge you to. I think it's a really good vehicle to do that, and we'll keep you up to date on our discussions with some of the other regulators through that forum. If you can't join that, but you're interested in being kept up to date, that's also fine. We will be publishing regularly to the website and to the platform on our progress. I don't have a fixed date of when solutions need to be in place, but clearly 2020 is looming upon us. I'm sure all of you in one way or another have clients that are uncertain about what to do next. There's no part of gold standard that obviously doesn't support the voluntary markets. We're not saying that the offsetting market should disappear and be replaced by something else, but we do want to use this opportunity to drive consensus with the other regulators on what the solutions need to be, and ideally get that in place as soon as possible this year or early next year. We really don't have too much more time, and I don't believe we can rely on the UN party process to resolve this for us. So that timeline will become clearer, but obviously we want to resolve it as soon as possible. So that's really it from me. There's a lot to take in, I know. No doubt people have a bunch of questions, concerns, fears. Just to reiterate, as I say, really that this is a gold standard problem. We're a participant in the voluntary carbon market, but it's a problem for all of us. It's a problem for the American standards. It's a problem for the voluntary use of CDM, and it's one that is a challenge for all of us with the uncertainty coming up. But I think, to end on a positive note, I also think it's an opportunity. I think it can show that the voluntary market needs to survive. The volume is such that it's relevant and important to climate efforts. And it's an opportunity, I think, to bring us all together to find consensus around solutions and claims. So I hope people aren't too disheartened by the problem. I appreciate it's a big one. I appreciate it must be a concern. But please do participate in the development from here. And we'd love to hear your ideas. So the next part is really for you guys. Feel free to ask any questions there in the questions box. If there aren't any, then we can end the call here. And if people want to send an email to me or my staff, then please feel free to do that. My email is owen.hewlett@goldstandard.org. So OWEN.HEWLETT. You can find my details on the Gold Standard website. And I'm very much an open door kind of guy. So please do reach out if you want to discuss this more privately. But yeah, I'll pause there for a minute to see if any questions pop up. Otherwise, we can end the call. Okay, I think clearly people didn't have any burning questions from that, which either means that I did a pretty good job, or you need to go away and think about it, or a bit of a combination of both. There is a question from Tim here. So, Tim, I think your question's being cut off there. I only see half a sentence. So, there we go. So I'll give it a minute while Tim types, and then I'll try and respond. Yeah. Yeah, Tim, I'm not sure if there's an issue with the typing. Here we go. Yeah. So I think what Tim is asking is the potential use of CERs to back up VERs where the national government won't retire AAUs. So thanks, Tim. That's a good question. That's really the solution for the kind of Kyoto period issuance of carbon credits. So So if you look at our double counting guidelines, similar to the other standards, where we issue a VER in one of the kind of non-target Kyoto countries, sorry, in one of the target Kyoto countries like Europe or Australia, for example, where they do have a Kyoto target, then we require the backing up of the VER with the cancellation of an AAU, or in some cases the cancellation of a CER. And so that is a relevant solution within the Kyoto Protocol era. And what we see is very much that AAUs in the Kyoto era, some countries are willing to do that. We certainly see that in the European bloc, where some countries are willing to cancel AAUs, but in others it can be very difficult. And so Gold Standard did a consultation a couple of years back, an extensive discussion with stakeholders to establish whether CERs could be cancelled in lieu of an AAU. And there's some good arguments for and against that, but in the end we settled. If you want to see that, you can see that on our consultation page and in our double counting guidelines. So it is something we allow right now. I don't think that's going to be a viable solution post 2020 under the NDCs, because AAUs are effectively an irrelevant term. They get replaced by an alternative mechanism, ITMOs, under the Paris Agreement, and I think they're a fair way off yet in terms of their use being clarified. So I don't see the kind of backing of a credit post 2020 being viable, but certainly under the Kyoto Protocol up until that point it's viable. I suppose the backing of a unit is similar to the forward kind of proposal to look at adjusting accounting adjustments of the NDC. So rather than cancelling an AAU, the government could potentially agree to adjust their NDC for that. But yeah, so in summary, I would say use of CERs or AAUs fine really under the Kyoto Protocol up till 2020, but post 2020, I think that option will need to be replaced by the NDC accounting adjustment option. What's my take on the consequences for GS-CERs? So that's a really interesting question, isn't it? So Claudia asks a good question. What's my take on the consequences for GS-labeled CDM CERs? So gold standard labels CERs issued by the UNFCCC. So the question really is, at the heart of that is what's the intention for CERs themselves? The gold standard label on top of the CER doesn't really imply an extra double count or anything. It's about the sustainable development quality of that CER. So what do I think the CDM will do? Well, I think this year we'll see, I'm hopeful this year we'll see the accounting rulebook, the Paris rulebook from the party process. That should be, I've heard, published by the end of the year, but honestly, I suspect that will creep into next year. And that will give us some clarity over the main rules for accounting for NDCs and the main rules for transferring emissions reductions between NDCs. So the use of internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, ITMOs. What a CER is in that post 2020 world is an interesting question. I think my reading of it is that the CERs will exist in some form, but I suspect the mechanism will be updated. It's already obviously called the Sustainable Development Mechanism. Exactly what the accounting rules for that will be, I'm not sure. As long as the option exists, whether it's in the current format or a new format, Gold Standard will be there to label it. So certainly we won't be retracting our certification of those projects. What we can't sort of guarantee, I suppose, is what the CER functionality will be post 2020, because that's not functionality we issue or we own. But what we can say is that our kind of backing for those projects will remain in place, and we'll be monitoring that through the kind of phase 2. So last question there from another colleague is that what about the Turkey condition? Can we just produce GSVERs from renewable energy projects? So I mean, Turkey will have its NDC post 2020, and so it will be swept up in the post 2020 double counting rules, just like everybody else is. I suppose there are a few interesting non-NDC options, like the United States. I'm not quite sure where that fits into this model yet, but they really are exceptions rather than the norm, I would say. So Turkey, like everybody else, will be swept up into whatever the new double counting solutions will be. We're exploring actually the renewable energy VER eligibility at the moment, so there'll be more on that shortly. So perhaps we can have a separate discussion about that, and very much happy to discuss further. Oh, sorry, I see the point of the question now. So Turkey doesn't have a target in the Kyoto phase. Yeah, so right now, so we're very much seeing the new solutions as something being rolled out post 2020. For those of you that follow the Paris negotiations, you'll know that actually the Paris Agreement doesn't necessarily start on January the 1st, 2020. In fact, there's no sort of clear date on start, but most people are working to that date. And so, in discussion with colleagues at other standards and with the CORSIA process, that's the date we're also working to. And so, in effect, what we're saying is that the Kyoto Protocol period runs until then, and then the Paris Agreement NDC solutions run post 2020. But obviously, we need those solutions before 2020 so that we're clear on what they are. But anything issued up until 2020 is covered by our existing double counting rules. You're completely right. Turkey is not a Kyoto target country. And so our rules on issuing carbon credits within Turkey remain in place. So there's no need to do anything particular with Turkish VERs up until that point. After 2020, as I say, those new solutions will kick in, and we'll obviously be discussing what to do about that. Yeah, so Turkey right now, up until 2020, the existing rules carry on. Yeah. Okay, some good questions there, and as I would expect, really, people concerned about what it means for their project. I guess you could sort of see this outreach from us almost like a bank where there's some regulatory changes happening. We obviously have a duty of care to you all to keep you informed anyway, but we want to do more than that. We want to include you guys in the solutions. We feel Gold Standard's well placed to hopefully drive and lead on some of those options with our colleagues at other standards. So my first commitment is to say that we are participating in those other development platforms. We do want to work with colleagues at other standards and with ICROA and with CORSIA, so very much not trying to do this alone. And my second commitment would be to try and include you in those discussions. So do please do reach out to us to join that platform. I'd be super keen to see you on that. So a couple more questions. Claire asks, what date did I say? So really, we're working at the moment towards a date of 1st of January 2020. There's no set down date in the Paris Agreement per se, but we're working towards a date of resolving solutions to come into force for post 1st January 2020. As I say, that's not actually set in stone in the Paris Agreement, and so it's subject to further discussions as we go through these solutions. But the working date for us certainly is the 1st of January 2020. I think either way, even if that went back, then I think it's valuable to all of us to push forward with solutions so that we can be ready. But yeah, we'll be working towards the 1st of January 2020. And then, do I think there'll be a transition period post 2020? I think the honest and slightly brutal answer is probably not. So a carbon credit either is or isn't double counted. And so, if it is double counted, then we need to do something about that because it undermines the integrity for everybody. And if it's not possible to cancel a different type of unit, then the new solutions need to come into place. Now, what I would welcome is where communities of developers are able and feel confident in discussing these matters with their host governments, then please do include us in those discussions because we feel we can help with that and reassure and help smooth that process. So I don't know whether there will be a transition period in certain countries. That's not only for Gold Standard or the other standards to decide. That's in part down to the Australian government and the Paris Rulebook as well. So the Paris Rulebook says that we're absorbed into the NDC accounting, and the Australian government doesn't offer any alternative solutions. Then we'll need to find a way to deal with double counting in a post-NDC world. I think it's as simple as that. But very much happy, Tim. I know in your case in Australia, it's a particularly kind of sensitive topic. We'd be very happy to discuss that with a kind of smaller Australian forum for those kind of land use projects and see how we can work together to find a solution that works for all parties. So we do have some good contacts with people like NCOS and with the Australian government. So perhaps that's something we can discuss offline. Great. Okay, I don't see any new questions there. There is another webinar this evening. If colleagues in different time zones of yours would like to join us, and both will be recorded, and we'll circulate a summary of the questions and the answers to everybody. So do look out for that. And so, just to urge you one more time, please do participate in this program. We are going to be running this platform development over the next 6 months. So please feel free to reach out to us and join. Or observe if you don't have the time. Then we would very much welcome inputs. Let's try and resolve this together. Great. Well, thank you very much, everybody. It's great to see such a great turnout. It's great to see the good questions. I'm looking forward to working with those of you that want to take this forward with us, and best wishes for your projects. Thanks, everybody.